5 years ago, the roar of tires, the crack of twisted metal, and a stormy midnight left Cole Remington, the youngest tech millionaire of his generation, trapped between life and death, his world reduced to a hospital bed and blinking machines in a wing of his estate no one dared to visit anymore. While his name echoed in boardrooms and headlines, his body lay still, a breathing statue frozen in time, and the world slowly moved on, except for one woman, Ember Callahan, whose own world had cracked long before his. Ember, the once spirited girl from Savannah, who lost everything, her family, her scholarship, her brother, thanks to a corrupted system that Cole's company unknowingly contributed to. Yet fate, cruel and strange, brought her to him again. This time not as a victim, but as a quiet shadow in his room. Hired as a low-wage caregiver, when all others had quit, Ember walked through the marble halls of the Remington estate every morning with silent steps and sleepless eyes, knowing the cameras watched her and the staff judged her, but refusing to leave the man who had no idea she was there. At first, he was just another patient, until one day she saw his lips twitch when she hummed a lullaby her mother used to sing, and something in her heart shifted. Cole, with his motionless body and eyelids that refused to lift, became her companion, her listener, her diary, her safest heartbreak. She began speaking to him, not because she believed he could hear, but because her soul needed someone to hear it. And soon her voice, soft and trembling, filled the corners of his sterile room with stories of childhood fires, broken dreams, her brother Liam's unjust death, and the anger she'd buried for years. She told him how she once dreamed of being a surgeon, but now cleaned floors and folded sheets. How people called her broken, but didn't know how hard she fought to survive. How love was something she didn't believe in anymore, until she found herself crying beside a man who hadn't blinked in 1,800 days. Then came the night the backup generators failed in a thunderstorm, and the IV stopped dripping, and the only source of water was in her bottle. But he couldn't swallow on his own, and without thinking, driven by fear and instinct, Ember took a mouthful and pressed her lips to his, letting the water slide between them. Not a kiss, but an act so intimate her entire body trembled afterward. She thought it would be once, but then the orders were delayed, and his body began drying out. And every day she fed him the same way, holding his jaw, brushing his lips, watching for the smallest twitch in his throat that meant he had taken it in. And as days became weeks, and weeks into years, the ritual became sacred, not in romance but in raw devotion. Something no camera, no doctor, no Remington relative ever saw or understood. She decorated his windowsill with wildflowers, read him stories, played his favorite jazz station even when it made her cry. And sometimes she'd sit beside him and whisper, "Don't come back for them, come back for you," her hand lingering on his chest just to feel the rhythm of life still fighting inside him. His skin remained warm, his lashes flickered once every few weeks. And every time Ember fed him water, she imagined for a moment that his lips pressed back. Not because he could, but because maybe somewhere inside, his soul remembered hers. She didn't know if what she felt was madness, trauma, or something deeper than words. But she couldn't walk away, not when he had no one else and she had nowhere else to belong. Even the nurses started calling her the ghost nurse, as she'd often fall asleep beside him, hand in his, dreaming of answers, healing, or just a sign, any sign, that he wasn't completely lost to time. And though she didn't say it aloud, Ember had made a promise long ago, one carved in the silence of that dim room, that she would wait. Not because she believed in miracles, but because her soul couldn't bear the idea of him waking up alone. In her heart, Cole wasn't the CEO they talked about on Forbes. He was the man who gave her a reason to breathe again, even if he never knew it. The world may have forgotten him, his board may have moved on, and his family may have come only for headlines. But Ember remained, hour after hour, day after day, lips to lips, water to mouth, heartbeat to heartbeat, until devotion no longer needed explanation, only presence. She had become his voice, his warmth, his guardian in the dark, and somewhere in a place science couldn't measure, Something inside Cole was listening. Somewhere in the quiet, uncharted corners of Cole Remington's mind, something stirred, a flicker of emotion without memory, a warmth with no source, a heartbeat that skipped whenever her voice filled the air. And yet, to the outside world, he remained the beautiful, broken monument of a man frozen in stillness, while vultures circled in tailored suits and whispered behind polished doors. His uncle Gerald, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, wore the mask of family concern, but his gaze was laced with suspicion, constantly watching Ember with hidden cameras and hushed conversations, convinced that her devotion hid an agenda, because power-hungry men like him couldn't imagine a world where love existed without gain. Cole's estate had become a battlefield of greed, with only one exception, Isla Remington, Cole's quiet younger sister, whose visits were rare but meaningful, always sneaking Ember her favorite snacks, slipping her notes with soft words of gratitude, and standing like a wall of calm against the storm of wealth-driven betrayal that brewed just beyond the walls. Ember felt the weight of judgment more each day. Maid staff whispered when she passed. Tabloids speculated about her presence. And even the nurses began distancing themselves from the girl who sat too long at his side, who stared too deeply at a man who never blinked back. But Ember didn't care. Not when she had something real in that room. Something deeper than facts, deeper than reason, something no headline could ever understand. Every morning she'd enter the room, press her hand gently to Cole's chest just to feel its slow rhythm, and begin speaking, pouring her soul into the silence with the kind of stories people usually hide away in diaries or lockboxes. Memories of watching her mother break from the weight of bills and lies. The last time she saw her brother Liam alive. The moment she found out the corporation Cole once led had tried to silence whistleblowers like Liam. The sleepless nights after his suicide. The scream she never got to release, and the guilt that clung to her bones like frost. She talked about dreams that never lived, about the cold hospital waiting rooms she knew too well, about the smell of her father's whiskey when everything went wrong, and how some days she stayed not out of duty, but because she didn't know how to breathe without the sound of his monitors. And always she came back to him, not as the man the world admired, but as the soul lying still, the one she imagined smiled on the inside every time she recited poetry, or played that one Ella Fitzgerald song he once had on repeat in his playlist. She never expected an answer, but sometimes when she leaned in close to wet his lips or whisper a thought, his chest would rise just slightly, as if her words stirred something sleeping inside. And though she'd never say it aloud, it gave her hope. Not foolish hope, but the quiet kind that grows roots when no one's looking. Gerald, meanwhile, was growing restless. He ordered deeper background checks, called Ember into unnecessary meetings, and tried bribing nurses for dirt, desperate to paint her as the opportunist he wanted the world to see. Because a girl like her, gritty, raw, selfless, was a threat to men who built empires on masks. Ember knew it too, but said nothing, choosing instead to protect Cole in the only way she knew. By staying, by guarding the fragile peace in that room with her stories, her touch, her quiet strength, and the fierce loyalty of someone who had nothing to gain but gave everything anyway. Sometimes when she sat by his bedside, she'd close her eyes and pretend they were in a different world. A cabin somewhere snowy, with logs crackling and laughter echoing. A world where he was awake and they shared breakfast and the pain never happened. And in those pretend mornings, she smiled, even as her real heart cracked a little more each day. She would often reach into her bag for Liam's old pocket notebook, flipping through its torn pages, filled with his messy handwriting and phrases like, "Truth is worth dying for," and whisper, "I'm doing this for you, Lee, but I think I'm staying for him." Because even though Cole had never said a word, she felt as if he somehow answered back, not in language but in presence, in the unexplainable shift of air between them when the world outside raged. And on one particular night, when the rain lashed hard against the windows and thunder growled like a wounded animal, Ember sat beside him with her hand on his wrist, telling him the story of the night she almost ended it all, the bridge, the cold, the note she had written, and how she changed her mind only because of a strange dream, where a man with blue eyes pulled her back and whispered, "Not yet." And though she didn't know his face, now she did. She leaned in to moisten his lips again, as always, careful and reverent. But this time she swore she felt them part slightly, not reflexively but with intention. And her heart raced, pounding so loud she thought the machines would register it. Her breath caught, and she stared at him, frozen, half in fear and half in wonder, unsure whether her mind was playing tricks or if something within him was beginning to stir. She leaned closer, her voice shaking now, and whispered through a tear, "Cole, if you can hear me, just stay with me, okay? I don't need a miracle. I just need you to fight." And though the machines beeped the same rhythm and his face didn't flinch, somewhere deep in the quiet, his heart pulsed not with survival, but with response. The morning was so still it almost felt sacred, a hush blanketing the hospital room like the world itself was holding its breath. And as golden sunlight spilled through the tall windows and bathed Cole's motionless figure in warmth, Ember stood beside him with the practiced calm she wore like armor, her hands steady but her heart heavy, from another long night of whispering memories and offering silence, her rawest truths. And when she leaned down, cupping his jaw to moisten his lips once again, with water passed gently from hers to his, it was meant to be routine, simple, clinical, nothing new, until in that fragile space where their mouths met, his lips moved with subtle but unmistakable intent, not the slack twitch of muscle memory, but a conscious response. A kiss, soft and fleeting, yet so real it tore through her with a force stronger than lightning. Ember gasped and staggered back, nearly knocking over the chair behind her, breath caught in her throat and panic fluttering in her chest like caged birds. Eyes wide as she stared at the man who had been a statue for 5 relentless years, wondering if she had imagined it or if grief had finally tricked her into hallucination. But then his brow furrowed slightly, his fingers twitched against the sheet, and in slow motion awe, she watched his eyelids tremble once, then twice, before fluttering open like a shutter long jammed by dust and time, revealing those unforgettable ocean blue eyes now clouded with confusion and brilliance all at once. He blinked slowly, like someone waking from a dream too long and too deep, his pupils scanning the ceiling in restless struggle before they suddenly locked onto her. Not around her, not past her, but into her, as if she were the only thread pulling him back from the void. And Ember's knees weakened as he opened his mouth, dry and cracked, and whispered with hoarse certainty, "Ember," a name he shouldn't have known, a name she had never spoken to him while he was conscious. Yet there it was, spoken like a memory etched into his soul, and the sound of it on his lips fractured her world into something unrecognizable. Nurses rushed in seconds later, summoned by the alerting machines that had suddenly jolted from their monotonous rhythm, and chaos unraveled in layers as doctors swarmed around him, eyes disbelieving, hands checking vitals, calling codes, flipping charts. As Ember stood frozen in the corner, her palms trembling and her mind spiraling with questions that no one could answer yet. News spread like fire through dry grass, first through the hospital staff, then through Cole's company, and within hours the media had caught wind, vans lining the driveway of the estate, helicopters circling like hungry crows, headlines flashing, "Sleeping CEO wakes after 5 years," with Ember's name attached like an asterisk. Her photo, stolen from her employee badge, plastered across every screen, as talking heads speculated about the mysterious woman who had stayed with him longer than anyone else. Suddenly, Ember was no longer invisible. She was no longer the girl quietly folding blankets and whispering lullabies to a man in a coma. Now she was a headline, a question, a controversy. The girl who kissed the millionaire awake, and the world began to chew on her story without knowing her truth. And, as if summoned by gold, Cole's family returned in droves. Gerald first, smug and calculating, giving tearless speeches about gratitude and family unity. Ela next with tears that were real and relief that softened Ember's ache, followed by distant cousins and board members all parading through the hospital, with concern dripping from designer sleeves and dollar sign motives, every one of them seeking to control the narrative, to erase Ember from it or use her for it, depending on how she could serve them best. Reporters camped outside her building, shoving microphones in her face when she went for groceries, spinning lies and romance from fragments they didn't understand, while Ember tried desperately to hold on to the sacredness of what had happened, the raw, inexplicable miracle of Cole saying her name like a secret he had carried through darkness. Inside his room, the chaos ebbed and flowed, but whenever she entered, he looked at her like she was gravity itself, anchoring him in a world that had moved too fast while he slept. And though he didn't remember the crash, didn't yet know the years he'd lost, he remembered her, not in specifics, but in essence, like her voice had been the lighthouse guiding him home through the thick, endless fog. And every time their eyes met now, there was something unspoken between them, a knowing, a pull, a question neither of them had dared answer aloud. And though the machines confirmed his vitals were stabilizing, his heart had found its rhythm, and his cognition was returning rapidly. Doctors remained baffled by how it had happened, offering theories about muscle memory and sensory stimulation. But Ember knew deep in her chest that this wasn't science. It was something else entirely, something the world couldn't wrap headlines around, something that pulsed between them like a shared heartbeat long before he ever opened his eyes. And in the moments before, they wheeled him to a more secure wing. When the cameras weren't looking and Gerald wasn't pretending to be noble, Cole reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over hers, and whispered, "I found you in the dark." And in that instant, Ember realized this wasn't the end of her vigil. It was only the beginning of a storm they both had yet to weather, with her heart standing in the eye of it, exposed and trembling. Cole's words, "I found you in the dark," still echoed in Ember's soul as the doors closed behind him, and she stood in the hallway clutching the silence like a wound, not knowing that behind those recovering blue eyes, something had already awakened that wasn't just memory, but a craving to understand, to connect the invisible string he felt binding him to the woman who had haunted his dreams and filled the void of his lost time with warmth. A voice, a presence that somehow mattered more than any name he saw on charts or in the sterile mouths of relatives. From the moment he opened his eyes, Cole had felt a pull toward Ember, not just attraction, but obsession wrapped in wonder, as if his body remembered what his mind couldn't, as if his soul knew something he was only now beginning to grasp. And so he started asking, softly at first, then urgently, who she was, what she meant to him, and why no one wanted to answer. Gerald, slick with charm and ambition, downplayed it all with calculated deflections, offering business updates and rehabilitation goals while quietly working behind the scenes to erase Ember from the equation, enlisting PR firms to reframe the story, feeding paparazzi lies that she was a manipulative nurse with a troubled past, a girl who'd clung to his bedside not out of loyalty, but to secure a place in his will or heart or fortune. The whispers grew loud outside. Articles, headlines, gossip on morning shows. And Ember, who once only had the silence of Cole's room to pour herself into, now faced a tidal wave of exposure she neither wanted nor caused. Cameras outside her apartment, reporters outside her sister's school, and cruel strangers calling her a gold digger when all she had ever given was quiet, unpaid devotion. And still, she refused to speak, refused to feed the circus. But inside Cole's new room, secured now from the outside noise, his questions sharpened, and his need for answers grew harder to ignore. He asked Isla one evening why Ember wouldn't see him anymore. And Isla, gentle, loyal, burdened with the truth, finally told him that Ember was being dragged through the mud while he rested, that she had lost jobs, privacy, and peace because of the world's obsession with the miracle she never tried to claim credit for. Something inside Cole cracked then, a rage he didn't know he carried rising through the weakness of his recovering body, and he demanded to see Ember, not later now. And when she finally walked in, hesitant, eyes red but unbroken, his first words weren't filled with gratitude or apology, but a whisper. "Tell me who you are. I need to know all of it." Ember stood silent at first, then slowly crossed the room, sat beside him, and after days of holding it all in, she finally opened the locked drawer of her past, The death of her brother Liam after being silenced by corporate power, her mother's breakdown, her abandoned dreams of medicine, the years she spent in the shadows just trying to survive without falling apart, and the day she took the job no one else wanted. Not because she expected recognition, but because something inside her whispered that her purpose was somehow tied to the man lying in that bed. She told him about the nights she read him poetry, the mornings she played jazz because the room felt too cold, and the water passed mouth to mouth not as scandal but necessity, not romance but mercy. And through her trembling voice, Cole saw not the opportunist the world had painted, but the only person who had shown up without a price tag, without a camera, without a script. And he listened, really listened, his gaze never leaving hers, every word another piece of the puzzle slotting into place inside his heart. Not his mind, not his memory, but the part of him that had felt alive only in her presence. He didn't speak when she finished, didn't interrupt, didn't pity, but his hand reached for hers, and this time, it wasn't weak. It was firm, intentional, steady. That night, long after she left, he stared out the window into the dark, not thinking about shareholders or wealth or the empire his name carried, but about a woman who had stayed, unseen and uncelebrated, through 5 years of silence, and how nothing in his life before her had ever felt this real. And in that quiet hour between recovery and reckoning, Cole Remington fell, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed everything. He fell for the truth of her, the strength of her, the depth of a girl who had no mask to remove because she had never worn one to begin with. The morning after Ember poured out her truth and Cole quietly reached for her hand, something between them shifted, not with words or declarations, but in the soft energy that now lingered in every glance, every moment they shared in silence. And so days later, when Cole's strength improved enough to leave the hospital under private care, he did something no one expected. Not Gerald, not Isla, not the press who still waited for headlines. He asked Ember to come away with him, not to another medical facility or high-rise penthouse, but to his secluded cabin nestled deep in the mountains, a place untouched by noise, money, or expectation. A place that once served as his escape from the weight of being Cole Remington and now felt like the only space where he could learn to breathe again. Ember hesitated, unsure if it was right, unsure what she was to him now. Nurse, savior, complication. But the way he looked at her, gently yet urgently, as if she was the only thread tethering him to something real, made her say yes. The drive was quiet but not awkward, filled with stolen glances. The hum of winding roads and golden trees blurring past like time itself was trying to soften their wounds. When they arrived, the cabin greeted them like an old friend, wooden, warm, wrapped in pine-scented silence. And Cole, for the first time since waking, looked at peace. They cooked together in mismatched mugs and pans, her laughter escaping in soft bursts as he burned toast and spilled water. Their movements clumsy but sincere, like two people learning each other's rhythm for the first time without rules or roles. That night, as the fire cracked inside the stone hearth and the stars blinked like distant promises above them, they sat outside wrapped in a single blanket, shoulders brushing, hearts pacing unevenly. Ember hadn't laughed like that in years. Not a polite chuckle, but real laughter that shook loose the grief curled inside her chest. And when Cole turned to her, blue eyes glowing with something deeper than gratitude, he said softly, "You didn't just keep me alive, you brought me back." And the way his voice broke on the last word made her throat tighten. She looked away, overwhelmed, but his hand gently found hers. Not grabbing, not pulling, just resting there with respect and quiet warmth. And then, slowly, his other hand reached up and tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering near her cheek as if memorizing her face, and he whispered, "You're the only part of the world I remember." Not with melodrama, but with the aching honesty of someone who'd seen everything blur except for her. Ember's breath hitched, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, and she didn't know whether to move forward or run, but her heart decided before her body could. She leaned in, just enough, and he met her halfway. Their kiss wasn't urgent or hungry, but gentle, reverent, A meeting of two people who had shared silence longer than words, who had seen each other at their most raw and unguarded. It was the kind of kiss that didn't promise forever, but acknowledged the now, the moment, the miracle of being here together despite everything broken behind them. When they pulled away, their foreheads touched and neither said a word for a long time, because language felt too small for what they both carried in their chests. But Ember's joy was tangled with fear, because as his fingers laced with hers and the moonlight wrapped around their shadows, she knew there was still a truth inside her, one secret, buried and burning, that could shatter everything if spoken. The cabin still smelled of pine and firewood when the kiss faded into memory. But Ember's heart thudded with a rhythm that wasn't peace. It was panic, the kind that lives in the chest when truth waits unspoken. She lay awake long after Cole fell asleep beside the hearth, watching the shadows move across the wooden beams, her thoughts spiraling around the letter she had hidden deep inside her coat pocket, its edges worn from the number of times her fingers had gripped it like a blade. The envelope had arrived that morning, slipped under the cabin door with no return address, but a seal she recognized. The family crest of the Remington estate, cold and deliberate, and inside Gerald's words sliced clean through her calm. "We know your brother tried to expose illegal testing buried in Cole's biotech division. Your silence makes you look complicit. Careful what truth you bury. Some of it grows back stronger." Ember's hands shook as she read it again, the shame and dread crawling back into her skin like it never left. She had kept Liam's involvement from Cole not to manipulate him, but to protect him. Because the Cole she had come to know, the one who whispered her name like a prayer, didn't deserve to be burdened with the sins of a company he hadn't actively run in years. But now her silence was being twisted into a weapon, and worse, into betrayal. She stepped outside into the chilled mountain air to breathe, to think, to cry without him seeing. But fate had sharper timing than either of them expected. As she whispered into her phone, begging Isla for advice and admitting the truth. About Liam, about the file he tried to leak, about how Ember had chosen love over revenge. Cole had stepped outside to find her, smiling, ready to ask her to stay another week, only to freeze when he heard her say, "I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to hate himself for what his company did to Liam. I didn't want to lose him." The smile died before it could reach his lips. He didn't speak, didn't step closer, didn't ask for clarity. He just stood there, heart cracked wide open, not by the truth itself, but by the feeling that he had let himself believe in someone again, only to be left stumbling in a fog of half-told truths. When Ember turned and saw him standing by the trees, his face already a mask of silence, her breath caught in her throat and her voice reached for him, but he turned before she could form a single word, walking back toward the cabin with shoulders rigid and eyes refusing to meet hers. And the door closed behind him, not with a slam, but with the soft, final sound of a heart choosing silence over confrontation. She didn't follow, not immediately, frozen in the cold, arms wrapped around herself like they could hold in the pieces of what was breaking all over again. When she finally returned inside, he was gone. No note, no message, just the memory of a kiss and the echo of footsteps that didn't pause. The fire had burned low, but it still flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the room that only hours ago had felt like sanctuary, and Ember collapsed onto the couch, bearing her face in trembling hands, trying to hold back the tears that no longer listened to reason. The silence between them now wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, punishing, a chasm that stretched with every minute he didn't return, and all she could hear in her head was the sound of her brother's voice the night before he died. "The truth will hurt, Emmy, but the lie will kill you." And now she didn't know which part had destroyed her more. The truth she kept, or the man who walked away without asking why. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't comfort but suffocated, and Ember stood in the center of it with her suitcase half packed and her heart barely holding together, her hands trembling around the zipper she couldn't seem to close. She had run out of reasons to stay, not just in the city, but in a life that kept tearing her open just as she tried to heal. And the memory of Cole's retreat, the way his eyes looked through her as if she were a stranger, played on repeat in her mind, louder than any goodbye. But miles away, That same silence was beginning to unravel Cole from the inside out, his thoughts restless, haunted not only by what he'd heard, but what he hadn't let himself hear fully. Her voice, her fear, her reason. Unable to sit still, he tore through documents, his instincts refusing to believe the betrayal he'd assumed, and buried beneath encrypted emails and old whistleblower reports. He found it, proof that Gerald, not Liam, had orchestrated the scandal. And worse, the crash itself had been no accident, but a cover-up meant to silence the one man brave enough to expose the truth. It wasn't Ember who betrayed him. It was Gerald who used everyone like pawns, including Cole. A tidal wave of shame and clarity hit him at once, and without even stopping to change, Cole raced through the city with the urgency of a man who'd been too blind for too long. When he reached her apartment, breathless and torn open by truth, he found her standing in the doorway, fingers hovering over her suitcase like she wasn't sure whether to leave or collapse right there. And when their eyes met, time stopped. He stepped forward, words caught in his throat, and then fell to his knees, his hands reaching for hers like a drowning man finding shore, his voice shaking as he whispered, "Forgive me. You fed me life for 5 years. I didn't just wake up because of you, Ember. I came back to life because you never left.